I'm critical of capitalism. I make no secret about that. And as someone interested in politics and economics, I spend a decent amount of time looking into what makes society function and possible alternatives to our current system. In my experience, the most detailed critiques of capitalism tend to come from leftists. So you can imagine my curiosity when I encountered the work of a man who didn't fit into any boxes. A man who was neither left nor right wing. A man so based that he is currently serving a life sentence in federal supermax. I'm talking, of course, about Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Ted has an unorthodox philosophy. Rather than criticizing capitalism for the problems Kaczynski identifies, he goes a level deeper and points the finger at industrial society itself. He was so sure of this, in fact, that from 1978 to 1995, he delivered a series of package bombs to people that he blamed for the advancement of industrial society. But who was Ted Kaczynski really? You'll get many different answers depending on who you ask. Isolated madman, misguided genius, lone wolf revolutionary, MK Ultra victim. So I took it upon myself to read Kaczynski's manifesto cover to cover to find out more about his beliefs, what drove him to such drastic measures, and perhaps catch a glimpse of the real Kaczynski. In order to understand Kaczynski's philosophy, we have to understand what he calls the power process. Kaczynski defines the power process as a series of activities that humans must consistently fulfill in order to meet their psychological needs. The power process consists of setting a goal, exerting a decent amount of effort to achieve that goal, and finally achieving said goal. Ancient humans, according to Kaczynski, spent most of their time struggling for the necessities of survival and were therefore able to naturally fulfill the power process. But according to Kaczynski, modernity disrupts the power process, either by making the attainment of goals laughably easy or rendering them impossible. And since humans can't fulfill the power process naturally, Kaczynski says this gives rise to surrogate activities, such as science, art, activism, or the pursuit of material wealth. Kaczynski says this crushing and unnatural nature of modernity leads to social, psychological, and environmental problems. And if you want to know what I think about this, I think it's pretty dumb. Even back in the hunter-gatherer days, when we were living as Ted intended, humans were creating art, divining the stars, adorning themselves with jewelry, and engaging in complex rituals and festivals. For example, humanity's oldest monument, Göbekli Tepe, built by hunter-gatherers in 10,000 BC, was not for storing food, and it wasn't a defensive structure either. It was a religious site. I think it's really telling that some of the earliest artifacts we have of humans are things that were not necessary for their survival. Can you imagine chipping one of these rocks, hauling it into place, and then carving it pretty much by hand? That's a surrogate activity if I've ever seen one. And so I would argue that these dismissively named surrogate activities are not an unfortunate byproduct of modernity, but rather core to what we are as a species. And to deny that is sort of a denial of our humanity, in my opinion. Almost like Ted wants us to return to monkey. It's not uncommon to hear the phrase return to monkey online. While ironic, I think it does expose some sincerely held desire to return to a simpler time, before humans had to worry about bills, being on time, or looking good in their casual Instagram photos. As climate change, inequality, and various social problems brought on by the digital age worsen, it's becoming harder and harder to ignore the issues that global capitalism is causing to our civilization. Kaczynski's work gives the right the intellectual backing to criticize society while simultaneously excusing capitalism and offering a tongue-in-cheek solution. Burn it all down, return to monkey. But this is a fantasy solution, proposed by people who want to criticize modernity without taking on the intellectual burden of imagining a post-capitalist world. These people don't actually want to go back to the Stone Age. They couldn't even last a day without their microwavable tendies. And even if we could magically turn back the clock, humans are naturally inventive, and cosplaying as the Flintstones wouldn't change that. One way or another, we would innovate our way back to industrial society eventually. The truth is, we can't go back. The only way out of this is forward. Unfortunately, those on the right are unable to acknowledge that. Creating a humane society in harmony with nature would mean eliminating industrial capitalism as practiced. And conservative ideology is both tied to capitalism and resistant to change. In terms of Kaczynski's continuing political and cultural relevance, I believe we must view this manifesto as a reactionary text. While most conservatives would be happy to roll back society to the 1980s or 50s, Kaczynski wants us to go back to a time without agriculture. Ted gets a lot of credit online for being some sort of prescient thinker, a genius visionary that was able to skillfully diagnose the ills of modernity. But in terms of Ted's critiques of society, that it reduces our freedom, alienates us from our labor, and causes psychological and environmental problems, he doesn't really bring up anything new. Pretty much everything he discusses has been brought up by leftist thinkers before him. Leftist thinkers, by the way, who didn't murder people with Rube Goldberg machines. Now, to his credit, his point about technology and its potentially destructive aspects is something that is rarely brought up or focused on by leftists. And again, to his credit, perhaps there are some technologies that we would be better off not discovering, such as nuclear weapons. But the same technology that allows us to split the atom to level cities also has the potential to provide clean energy to the entire world. And I think that's what Ted can't grasp here. Technology is simply a tool, and humans have always used tools. It's kind of what defines us as a species. And tools are neither good nor bad. Their worth depends totally on who uses them and for what purpose. Now, Kaczynski is obviously adept at picking out problems with society, and game recognized game for that one. That's pretty much all I do on TikTok. But ultimately, I think Ted suffers from a lack of imagination here. He thinks the problems that he describes are an unavoidable result of any sort of progress. In other words, his work represents a failure to envision a future beyond capitalism, a subject I've touched on in other videos, hint hint. And when you begin to view Kaczynski's philosophy in this light, it begins to make much more sense. I mean, a system that is oriented only towards making a profit at the expense of human welfare or the health of the environment is going to use technology in some pretty messed up ways. And if you think that that system is the only arrangement that could possibly exist, then yeah, I understand why you would think technology was a net negative. Ultimately, Kaczynski isn't wrong. Modernity has certainly created some pretty big problems. But whereas Kaczynski sees these challenges and wants to shrink back from them to his simple, more primitive time, I see a more sunny future, where the engine of society is not destroyed but rather rewired to pursue human well-being instead of profit. A future where humans are free to spend their time on frivolous surrogate activities like art, science, and self-development. And oh yeah, my future has electricity too.